Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's learning session, Forest and REDD Plus Expectations for COP22 Marrakech. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Emmeline Gasparini, and I'm a Program Associate with the Forest and Climate team. And our presenters today are also from the Forest and Climate team. I'm joined today by Josefina, Brana-Varela, and Naikoa, Aguilar, Amuchastegui. For those of you who have participated in our presentations before, they will be familiar names for you, and I'm very excited to hear what they have to say today. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in these past sessions, this will sound familiar. Yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a day or so on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, these are sometimes caused by having too many browser windows or programs open at once. So feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're always welcome to join us by phone. If you continue to have technical difficulties, please send me a message via the chat area and I'll try to get you sorted out. Questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions anytime during the webinar using the toolbar on your screen. We don't use the hands up function, we use the questions function. We'll answer as many of your questions as possible during our allotted time. After the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional forest and climate resources from WWF, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the recording of the session when it's live. Thank you again so much for joining us, and with that, we'll get started. Josefina, take it away.
Thank you, Emmeline, and hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. What we'll be covering today is where I'm going to give you an introduction to understand where are we at now in the road to the COP in Marrakech. I'm going to talk a little bit about the inside track of the negotiations, what is happening, where we were left after the Paris Agreement, and what is next, what can we expect to see in Marrakech happening. Then I would briefly talk about what is happening outside this more formal negotiation track. I'm going to give some overview about the Global Climate Action Agenda. And then we are going to talk about what is happening in the implementation side. And for that, Naikoa Aguilar will talk about our findings on the front of reference levels particularly. So let's start. Can we go to the next slide, please? So as you may remember, we had a very successful last conference of the parties for climate change last year in Paris. The Paris Agreement was adopted, and now we are left with some things that need to be resolved. But where are we now at the moment? We have the good news very recently that the Paris Agreement actually is going to be entering into force as soon as November 4th, which is it's a good news. We were not sure when the Paris Agreement was going to enter into force. We had to have at least 55 countries ratifying the agreement, representing 55% of the global emissions, and this was expected to happen perhaps before 2020, but we didn't know that this was going to be so soon. So I think this is very good news. We know that 77 countries have ratified as of today, and this represents more or less around 60% of the global emissions. So that means that the Paris Agreement is entering into force this year. So what we do normally is we talk about expectations of what is happening in the next COP in this webinar on forest discussions. However, we have a particular situation now, which the discussions are going to be broader and are going to be related more to this architecture of the Paris Agreement. So how now that the Paris Agreement is entering into force, there are some issues that need to be resolved. And we are going to talk about this now in relation to forest. So as I mentioned, I'm going to divide this conversation in the inside track about the formal negotiations process and what can we expect in the discussions in Marrakech, and then what about other issues that are happening outside. So next slide, please. Inside the negotiations. So can we go to the next slide so I can tell you a little bit of, let's do a recap of what happened in Paris. And I'm not going to be going into the details. If you want to see thorough explanation of the Paris results, you can check our webinar that we did after the Paris Agreement was adopted. But I just wanted to give a recap and this overview for you to remember that forests in the Paris Agreement are not only in Article 5, which is exclusively or more explicitly related to forest and land and REDD+, but actually there are different provisions and different language across the Paris Agreement that has relevance for the forest agenda. We have some mentions on the preamble, some mentions of forest or language that makes reference indirectly in the Article 2, which is related to purpose. We have some provisions on the communication of NDCs and the Article 4 of mitigation. And we have some other provisions in the article related to the Sustainable Development Mechanism, finance, and transparency. For today's presentation, I'm going to be focusing on mainly Article 3, 4, 6, and 13, which are the articles that that have some work program for Marrakech. So just for us to know what is the focus of the discussions in Marrakech and how this has relevance for forest. I'm not going to be talking about Article 5 because we have discussed that in a previous webinar, but if you have any questions, please let me know. So let's go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be focusing more in the articles that have some actionable language of what is needed to happen next and what parties to the convention need to be focusing on. The Article 3, which relates to mandates the communication of these nationally determined contributions, and Article 4, which focus more in dictating what needs to happen in the front of mitigation, are important for forest because, first of all parties, not only developed country parties, but all parties now have the obligation to submit and to undertake and communicate ambitious efforts that should be aligned to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. The way they can do this is by submitting these nationally determined contributions that need to be showing ambitious efforts, should be sharing how countries are going to implement actions to reach global peaking of these emissions as soon as possible, and then how they plan to undertake rapid reductions once they have peaked their emissions. These articles, well, in particular Article 4 about mitigation, explicitly mentions that there has to be, we should be aiming to achieve a balance between emissions from sources and removals by sinks. What it means is, well, sources is, well, what are the sources of emissions that a country economy has, but also the removals by sinks. And when we see this word, sinks of greenhouse gases scattered in the agreement, that means land, forest, and some other could say that oceans as well. But the convention uses this more technical language to refer to natural sinks. So how we achieve this balance? Well, we have to definitely keep the carbon on the ground and have sinks that are larger than the emissions of the sources that we have. So this article talks about this balance. So obviously, because forests are part of these sinks, it's important to keep that in mind, because what is happening is, well, every 5 years countries will submit their plans and they have to include information about this. The other provisions in this article mention the need to have economy-wide targets and mention that developed countries should continue taking the lead and show that they are putting forward economy-wide targets. That means emissions reductions across sectors, and understanding that developing country parties are doing this exercise for the first time should be working with the information and data they have, but they should be aiming ultimately to have also economy-wide targets. However, I think what we should be looking at here is the paragraph that you see in blue. Because this is the paragraph that kind of dictates what is happening or what needs to take place looking forward. And this is the need to account for anthropogenic emissions and removals. So this needs to be recorded, and parties need to show that they have an accounting system for emissions. So how the land sector and how the emissions on the forest sector will be recorded, we don't know. We don't even know how the accounting framework in general for NDCs is going to be looking. So this is something that is going to be subject of further work by the parties of the convention in these following meetings. So this is about NDCs and accounting of emissions. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the next article that is going to be very relevant to keep an eye because it may have an impact on the forest agenda is the market that, is the article that relates to the market and non-market approaches to sustainable development. Article 6, as you may remember, recognize that parties may choose to cooperate voluntarily for the implementation of their NDCs, as long as it is allowing for higher ambition. So what this means is that there's this the establishment of the Sustainable Development Mechanism, which in a voluntary basis parties could use, but there has to be certain rules for this mechanism that need to be figured out. But one provision that is explicit in the agreement already is that the emissions reductions cannot be used both by the host party and another party to demonstrate its own achievement of goals on NDC. What it means and why this is important is that this is a provision that aims to avoid double counting of emissions, or that two countries claim emissions reductions when the emissions reductions are only taking place in one country. So this is about environmental integrity and making sure that we are really globally achieving emissions reductions and not shifting emissions from one way to another. However, if you see there's another concept introduced in this article, which is the ITMOS. You are going to be listening a lot of ITMOS use, and this is the internationally transfer mitigation outcomes. This article includes this or introduces this new concept into the agreement, but we don't really know much about them yet. How the ITMOS would work, who can transfer, what are the conditions for transferring, etc. So the only things that we know about this transfer of mitigation outcomes is what you see in your screen. There's mention of different principles of the convention that are key and important. Again, environmental integrity and transparency. It highlights the need to have robust accounting, as we were discussing in the article of mitigation, and we need to avoid double counting. However, again, we don't know what are the specific rules or guidelines for this, as well as we don't know which sectors can be part of this sustainable development mechanism. Finally, I just want to highlight that this is not only about market. This Article 6 also includes a provision for non-market approaches, and it highlights the need to promote both mitigation and adaptation ambition. So it's not only about mitigation but also adaptation, and there's a mention about the need to enhance not only public efforts but also private participation in the implementation of NDCs, which I think is also a new concept that has been introduced. Again, the actionable part of this article related to market and non-market approaches is in blue in your screen, and it says that the conference of the parties serving as the meeting of the parties for the Paris Agreement, which is the CMA acronym, will need to adopt these rules, modalities and procedures for the Sustainable Development Mechanism. So just to give you an example of why this is relevant for forests, well, it may be that the parties decide that forests should not be part of this Sustainable Development Mechanism, or that forest emissions reduction should not be part of this, or should not be eligible to be internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. We don't know. There's nothing written about it yet, so these discussions will be relevant in that context. Can we go to the next slide, please? So transparency. Article 13 establishes a transparency framework, which is not a new concept under the convention, but there are different pieces that the UNFCCC has already established as key pieces for building on this framework. Different pieces that have already been decided in previous decisions are the fact that countries need to submit national communications, have biennial update reports, etc. So it is not starting from scratch. The transparency framework will build on these different pieces of the climate architecture. But what is, I think, what is important is that now is centered in the Paris Agreement and in our global goals that we all have. So this transparency framework also is not going to be only focusing on actions and tracking progression of emissions reductions and this shift to low carbon development, but introduces a different, a new dimension of transparency, which is the transparency of support. So it's not only about actions and efforts of countries in reducing emissions, but also tracking progress on financial commitments from donors or from developed country parties. So it has pieces included for this part of transparency of support that have to do with tracking finance, technology transfer, capacity building support, etc. So I think this is good because it allows us to follow both tracks, the implementation track and the need for providing support for developing country parties to do the shifts. I guess what is important here is this transparency framework obviously is going to be very related to the discussions on mitigation and how the accounting framework is going to be devised for NDCs. But it's good to have the transparency framework not only capturing the efforts or capturing the NDCs that have been submitted by parties, but actually it needs to track progression. So it needs to be able to show information of that countries are actually not only submitted their NDCs, but actually making progress in meeting those targets and those goals. So I think this is going to be a key piece for the Paris Agreement to work and to show that transformation is happening, if we are going in the right direction, if we need to change trajectory, etc. So this is a key piece for helping us to understand how we are moving forward. Again, the paragraph in blue shows what is the exact language that the agreement includes in terms of next steps, and it says that the CMA shall adopt common modalities, procedures, and guidelines for the transparency of action and support, and this is because we cannot have a different mechanism for each country, but we have to have a global framework that allows us to understand what are we doing globally. So this is what we are going to be seeing. Overall, I just want to say that these discussions, as you can see for the slides and the information that we are sharing with you, the discussions are expected to be more technical at this point. What we saw in June in the last meeting of the subsidiary bodies in Bonn in the summer is that the parties are regrouping and are trying to structure how the discussions are going to be taking place, what are the groups that need to be formed, who needs to discuss what. And then what we saw in the subsidiary bodies meeting in the summer is that the discussions are starting to be higher level, more general, not sector specific. So I think what we may be looking to see in Marrakech is a continuation of that process that started in the summer about general discussions, and then little by little, maybe not in Marrakech, but next year, understanding what are the gaps or the specific needs to have decisions related to forest or land or any other discussions that are more explicit. How does these discussions need to be incorporated in the broader architecture? So we normally have seen in previous years that the discussions on forest have advanced in their own groups and in their own bubble, a little bit disjoint from the general architecture. At this point, we are seeing a change in pace. We are seeing that parties are going to focus first in the general architecture of the Paris Agreement, in the flesh and bones that will give life to the agreement, and then to understand what are the gaps, technical gaps that are needed to reflect correctly sectors as forest and land. So this may mean that in Marrakech you won't see a specific discussion or a specific group of people discussing things related to forest. So this is an important clarification that we wanted to provide. Can we go to the next slide, because now I think what I would like to do is shift completely from this more like very technical and formal track of the negotiations to the outside, what is happening in the outside related to the Paris Agreement, but not within the formal process of the negotiations. So can we go to the next slide, please? So the Global Climate Action Agenda. One thing that we saw starting a process that started in Lima was this action agenda concept, and as some of you may remember, this was called the Lima Paris Action Agenda that was launched in the COP in Lima, aimed to provide a platform to connect the public efforts to other actors or other stakeholders that are also taking action in the climate change agenda, but that do not have a platform or that are not connecting actually to the architecture and to our all global common goals. So the action agenda, it's all about implementation. It tried to catalyze and enhance action originally pre-2020, but also post-2020 in general, just catalyze implementation of actions. But most importantly, I think one of the features or the key characteristics of the Global Climate Action Agenda is that it aimed to catalyze engagement of non-state actors. So what businesses, civil society organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, what other non-state actors are doing, and how we can connect the state and the non-state actors to align to the Paris Agreement goals. So I think key features, apart from that one, that is the main, I guess, one of the main objectives was to increase international collaboration, to accelerate cooperative climate action, to be able to inspire partnerships between governments, developed and developing, but also between state and non-state actors. Last year, the Lima Paris Action Agenda it contained 12 thematic areas, including forests, renewable energy, cities, agriculture, etc. And it did mobilize state and non-state actors together. There were different thematic days to showcase progress in these thematic areas, and we managed to see countries and non-state actors coming together to show how they plan to collaborate, to increase ambition and to help us close the gigaton gap and close to have more ambition overall in the long term. So just to give you an overview, the forest thematic area included countries with important forest cover that made some announcements about important goals or plans parallel to the UNFCCC official process, some of them related to the REDD plus strategies or action plans. We have donors also making announcements, in particular Germany, Norway and the UK pledged $5 billion to forest countries that produce verified results. But we also have private sector promising important contributions. For example, 42 major companies committing to deforestation-free supply chains by 2020. So overall, it was a good initiative. I think what is key is that that the action agenda becomes a process and it becomes a platform to catalyze action, and it's not one day in the COP that serves to give visibility to few people. I guess the important is that the global action agenda, at least what we are trying, is to make this as a platform for opportunities that inspire others to join action in the different sectors. For us is very important the forest thematic area, and what we are going to see this year in Marrakech, and we are happy to see the continuation of this effort by the Moroccan presidency. They are going to organize, they transform the Lima Paris Action Agenda in the Global Climate Action Agenda, and we'll have the Forest Thematic Day on November 8th. Which will include a showcasing segment and will include also a segment on dialogue on key forest relevant issues moving forward. So this is a nascent process. The UNFCCC has named, and the Paris Agreement decisions actually created this figure of the high-level champions. As you may know, Minister Hakima El Aite and Laurence Toubiana from France, both of them are, one from Morocco, one from France, are the high-level champions that have within their main task to keep pushing and keep promoting this action agenda, which I think is key to keep the momentum and to maintain the momentum and keep inspiring others to join the climate action. So with that, I think I'm going to finish my talk and give the floor to Dr. Naikoa Aguilar, which is our forest carbon scientist and our Director for Forest Carbon Science, to talk about what he has been observing in the implementation side, in particular in the implementation of the Warsaw Framework for REDD+, and what countries have been doing, starting with a key piece, which is the reference levels submissions. So, Naikoa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Josefina. Well, hello, everybody. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about one of the cornerstones for the implementation of the REDD+ mechanism, which is the submission of the reference level to the UNFCCC, and a little bit of an analysis that we have carried out both with country implementers or people who are involved in the construction of the reference levels, civil society, as well as members of the technical assessment teams that are from the part of the UNFCCC assessing these submitted reference levels. As some of you might already know, we have already 15 countries that have submitted their reference levels so far and are listed here in this slide. They have done in two, if we may call them, batches. Initially, it was a group of, if I'm not wrong, 6 countries that was followed by the rest of the countries, and we have gone so far through 2 technical assessment rounds. The first one has already delivered its results in terms of having access to the public documents resulting from that, both the technical assessment reports as well as the updated reference levels submission. And for the second one, we're still waiting for the results to come, and this happened earlier this year in Bonn. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we have done is to try to work with members of partner organizations, notably EDF, the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Nature Conservancy, as well as the people involved in the process itself, to collect the lessons learned from the process of elaborating the reference levels. what have the countries gone through in terms of putting together these constructs, and also the team members of the assessment process. What have they gone through in their interactions with the country. So we have done a series of workshops. We're up to 3 right now, but the latest one was done in Bonn right after the latest SAFSA intersessional, in which we brought together reference levels creators, assessors, and for the first time to discuss and try to see on a constructive way what were the lessons learned and what would they be willing to tell the rest of the countries who are embarked currently in the process of building and hopefully submitting their reference levels. I want to highlight that during this session we had the opportunity to have the participation of Dr. Jean Penman, which was one of the persons involved in a long process with IPCC and other mechanisms with UNFCCC, and that sadly died right after the meetings because of bike accident. So there's a report coming soon out of this work that we are dedicating to him. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of lessons that were identified during this process that perhaps might be relevant to you. I certainly would like to advise you to have a look at the report once it's out. But the biggest points that I want to highlight here are the ones that I'm going to be talking right now. And the first one is a big realization that transparency is perhaps your best ally in this process. It was clear for the participants that this is basically a learning by doing process. No one, no country, no technical assessment team member had gone through this process before, and we're basically learning by doing in terms of reporting to the UNFCCC, putting the together the constructs that are the reference levels, as well as technical assessment team members facing the situation of having a look at these submitted reference levels and then assess them under the scope of the criteria defined by the decisions, the relevant decisions of the COP. Based on that, and the idea that we're learning by doing, and that this is a process that goes little by little, you can always update your reference level. We together concluded that it was very important that, and perhaps constructive, to have full transparency in the process in terms of what information was used, how it was used, with which methods, which assumptions, and so on. So the interactions between the countries and the technical assessment team members would be the most constructive, as constructive as possible. But this also highlighted the necessity for donors to participate in the process, because donors are also involved in this process for the first time, and a prescriptive approach perhaps is ill-advised because no one has a prior experience on doing this. One key aspect that came up quite often was the issue of accuracy and uncertainty, how to deal with that, particularly when talking about specific activities such as degradation, which is a loose concept, difficult to hone into in terms of defining how you or the countries will deal with assessing and quantifying related emissions. And based on this idea of transparency as towards a constructive process, it was agreed that it would be important to expose what approaches countries are thinking about using or are considering, at least as an annex, which some of the countries did, but also that the technical assessment team should involve into providing feedback on those annexes, even though they are not part of the main body of the reference level submission. But then the next step about that is the fact that it was clear that there needs to be clarity, or countries need to work together, implementing countries or donors, into how to deal with the uncertainties, because these are always going to be there. They're not going to go away, and basically we need to figure out how to deal and live with these uncertain numbers, because basically we can't wait until we reach a level of comfort that perhaps we will never reach before beginning the process of actually implementing mitigation actions on the ground. I have a quote there and a joke for you to think about these aspects, but just something to keep in mind. Next, please. The other aspects that were assessed, once again, following the criteria established by the relevant decisions on from the COPs, are consistency and completeness. These were terms that were, we found that depending on whom you're talking with, you find different interpretations. But there's a general feeling that even though it's not required for all the reference level to be comparable amongst themselves, it's always ideal and it would be beneficial that a level of consistency could be obtained. And this is one of the reasons why we carried out this assessment and analysis of lessons learned, and we're going to continue doing, which is basically to try to see what is working, what's not, and perhaps by doing so, little by little, the process is gonna gravitate towards a certain level of consistency across the board, or as close or as high as possible. In terms of completeness, we found that there's different interpretations. Some would interpret completeness as all pieces required to understand how the construct of the reference level was made are in place and available to both the technical assessment teams as well as anyone who reads the reference level. And others saw that, for example, it referred and had information on all the carbon pools as well as all the activities. So this is something that perhaps we're going to reach some level of consistency as we see more countries' reference levels coming out and seeing how they deal with these two ways of interpreting things. Now, moving towards the assessment, moving towards comparability, sorry. Some of the things that, well, this is going back to the necessity of having the reference level, or the idea to have them comparable across the board. And then in terms of the assessment process, once again, highlight the fact that this is a learning by doing process also for the assessment team members, and they should or could participate in the process of providing feedback on how to incorporate other activities, as already mentioned. One of the things that we found is that the pool of technical assessment experts is still low. So there's going to need to figure out how to have more experts available for this process, because in some situations we found that some team members were participating in the elaboration of other countries' reference levels, whereas at the same time they were assessing the country reference level of another country. So this is a clear indicative that we have a low number of experts available to do the process. And then in terms of capacity for the countries, we found that in several cases it was not necessarily local country capacity who had carried out the elaboration of the construct of the reference level, but there was a high level of reliance on consultants. And it was agreed that this is not necessarily a bad choice, but this raised the flag in terms of making sure, or at least figuring out in the terms of reference, that the consultants really left the capacities behind for the country to move forward and carry on the baton in terms of perhaps updating the reference levels, but also in thinking further ahead in terms of how this reference level should be used. The next slide, please. This is a big lesson that several participants highlighted, and that became clear during the discussions, was that we have the tendency of assessing the reference levels under each one of the criteria, or the sets of criteria for their assessment, as separate elements. but it is clear that you have to look at the reference level as a complete construct that is the result of a rationale that is behind what's being proposed, the set of assumptions, the sets of justifications, and the data sets and activities used, and this construct needs to hold as a whole in itself. Only by doing that you will be able to get a general feeling on what the legitimacy or not, if you're looking into that, or on the compliance with the criteria under the convention and the standards that you would be using to judge or assessing the reference level. You always have to look at it as a whole thing and not the sum of the parts. Once again, uncertainty always across the board in the discussions. It's clear that it's high in some cases, but there's also the feeling that we need to figure out how to move forward while at the same time there can be continuous work and funding, which it's still needed and will still be needed. The implementation phase continues actually to produce estimates that provide what come with lower uncertainty levels. Then one thing that came up out of discussions, particularly on the MRV process, because in several countries the teams that are involved in the production of the reference levels are the same ones who are involved in MRV, and then there's a lot of activity happening at the national level, but also from the government basically, and as well as with communities, is that there is a need in compliance with the idea on transparency that I mentioned before, that it perhaps is much more intelligent to start thinking as MRV as a national, as in we are citizens of the country and we all participate in the process endeavor, rather than a compartmentalized endeavor in which you have government entities producing the national data sets, and then parallel to that we have NGO and civil society or communities carrying out their own activities without any linkages, and at the end up being competing proposals, and that ultimate goal should be at the end of the day a transparent participatory process. Next slide, please. Now, that being said, and with the very happy fact that we have 15 countries that have submitted the reference levels so far, 15 countries that moved forward and were the first ones to get their ideas and expose themselves to the assessment process, to the comments made by civil society and other countries. There's still some, at least from our perspective, aspects for improvement, as always. Inclusion of additional activities, inclusion of additional pools, but also the realization that at the end of the day, the reference level is a political decision that is data informed, and the use of the reference level will have a lot of impact in terms of if we are going to be really achieving emissions reductions or not. So basically, the real reductions will depend on the political will and how these reference levels are used and how they are linked with the national REDD plans, in which we might have reference levels that are above the historical, and then what is that going to result in actual emissions reductions, and how that happens with the activities on the ground is very important. And this is linked with the fact that we need donor countries and international organizations to continue supporting the implementation that countries and the use that countries are going to be doing of the reference levels, and support. From our perspective, we need to aim towards both the benefit of the countries, but also support climate integrity. Next. I think I'm done. So this is it from my part, and I think that we now move to the questions and answers, and hopefully answers session. Back to you, Emily.
We are. Thank you so much, Naikoa, and thank you, Josefina. So for participants, if you have a question you would like to ask either Josefina or Naikoa, please feel free to take this time to send us that question through the questions function. I've already got some that people have been asking throughout the presentation, so I'll start with those. But you're welcome to continue to ask questions, and if we run out of time, I'll do my best to chase down these two and answer any ones that we can't get to during this session. So the first question I want to ask is directed at Josefina. Could you talk a little bit more about the link between domestic markets and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement?
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, that's a very interesting question because there's nothing in the text right now in Article 6 that makes actually any clear link between an international market for emissions reductions and domestic markets. I think in this case, and given the language in Article 6 that highlights in several paragraphs that the ITMOS or the international cooperation is voluntary, it's going to depend more about each country legislation and approach. I think there are many countries that have said that they may be interested in developing a domestic market for emissions reductions, but not to participate in an international market. And there's other countries that are open to have domestic markets, participate in international transactions, etc. So I think there's no rules about it yet, and my expectation would be that whatever conversation happen in Article 6 is going to be focusing on the international dimension. Now, if we think about the climate architecture as it stands now, each country is now responsible to achieve targets and to submit these targets and to increase ambition over time. So it would depend on how a country is looking at their whole portfolio of emission reductions. But if a country would decide to transfer or sell or whatever word we want to use to this transaction, if they decide to transfer any emissions reductions, they will have to account these emissions that are leaving the country or this ownership of emissions that is leaving the country in their national accounting frameworks. So that cannot be a double counting. So the host country or the country that actually is performing or achieving these emissions reductions, if transfer this title of emissions, this needs to be deducted from the national accountability. So that will mean that they will have to do additional effort internally to meet the target because those emissions have already left. So I hope this is useful, but really there's no definitions or clarity on this issue, and my expectation is that domestic markets are going to be dealt with in a different way. Each country will put their own rules.
Great, thank you. Can you, probably both of you, talk a little bit more about the relationship between REDD reference levels and NDCs that countries are submitting?
I can start, and then Naikoa, if you want to jump in, please do so. Again, there's no rules or decisions in the UNFCCC that establish any link. However, as Naikoa was saying when making his last point about the MRV being a national endeavor thing, the more you align the pieces and the more you align your different systems, the better it would be for the host country, for the country that actually is developing all this architecture. So we would expect that the reference level it's linked to NDCs in the way that is related to the national inventories, that is related to the biennial update reports. So all of this needs to be different pieces of the same puzzle and needs to be aligned. This would be so much easier for any country that is submitting information to the UNFCCC that since the beginning, I mean, it will require some effort to align the pieces and to understand what part fits where, but from the beginning it would be such a good effort to do that, because then in future communications would be easier. Now, the other problem with reference levels and NDCs is the fact that we don't know if countries are actually including REDD Plus as part of the nationally determined contributions. So that's again something that countries themselves will need to figure out. REDD Plus, it's defined as an international incentive, and it's a voluntary effort. So there's no clarity on how countries are interpreting the definition of REDD in the context of the nationally determined contributions. However, this should not be an impediment or an obstacle for a country to have their accounting frameworks and their sources of information and the different pieces fitting together, making sense of what the country is doing and informing the plans moving forward. Naikoa, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, you said most of it, Josefina, just to underline the fact that the idea is that the REDD activities and the reference level are very well aligned with what in the end will be the overall greenhouse gas inventory accounting as we're moving towards a whole land sector and the new word of fashion, which is the global stock take and these type of things. But then underline as well the idea that the reference level, well, it all depends on how the country decides to use it, and if the country wants to propose to include REDD Plus as part of the NDCs, or it's going to include it as part of the part that would come under incentives, no? Which is so. I mean, I think that's a heated political discussion that we're going to be seeing in the upcoming years or so. Back to you.
Thanks, you guys. Sort of along those lines, is there a way that the convention can track any of these REDD initiatives since they are voluntary?
Sure. I mean, the REDD Plus framework has different rules that have been already adopted and approved. In the last pieces of the puzzle that were adopted under the Warsaw Framework for REDD Plus, there's the establishment of the Lima Information Hub, in which countries need to input all the information about the different requirements of the convention. For example, they have to submit their national REDD strategies. They need to have a link to the reference level that has been submitted and to the technical assessment of the reference level. They have to include the technical annex for the MRV system, and they also need to submit a report on the safeguards, how countries are addressing and respecting the safeguards. But not only that, they will have to include information of any payments that have been received for the results. So there has to be some sort of kind of like, it's not called registry, but for all practical purposes it's kind of a registry that is going to be publicly available, and it's going to be in the web platform of the UNFCCC. So if you go to the web platform, actually now you can already see who has submitted reference levels, and you can access the information that is there publicly available for everybody. Now, that doesn't mean that we have the architecture in place to link this information to the accounting framework for NDCs, which is one of the things I mentioned, that it's going to be interesting to see how the discussions on Article 4 evolve and how the accounting framework for NDCs is going to be created, and then to discuss how then REDD fits into that, that part.
Are there ways to monitor some of these big private sector deforestation-free commitments? And then as a sub-question, are countries required to, are there any obligations for countries to push these private sector commitments into compliance?
Thank you. Got it. Yeah, so the companies that have been doing these pledges, many of them are already listed in the New York Declaration on Forests. So if you go to the web page of the New York Declaration, you will find a list of 60 plus companies that have pledged to become deforestation free by 2020. More like notable ones, there are many, but the ones that I could remember: Cargill, Kellogg's, McDonald's, Nestle, Johnson & Johnson, Walmart, Unilever. So there are around, I think, 60 plus companies that have endorsed the New York Declaration, and that means that they are pledging to end deforestation. However, the tracking or the mechanism to hold them accountable, it's not an international one. Interestingly enough, within the Global Climate Action Agenda, one of the pieces that the champions are pushing for is the need to have information and data and to create a transparent system for everybody to be able to understand if we are making any progress or not. So this tracking progress piece of the Global Action Agenda started again launched in Lima with this portal that is known as the NAZCA portal, that if you go to the UNFCCC website, you can access the Action Agenda information, and including the NAZCA portal, in which everybody that, it's a voluntary portal, of course, you can submit your information and you can say, well, this is my initiative, this is what I'm doing. This portal is unfortunately too general, so it doesn't allow us to really track progress in the details, but I think it's a good starting point, and it has to be improved over time. Each of the thematic pillars of the action agenda are also trying to construct their own tracking mechanism. So for example, in the forest pillar, there is the discussion of having the New York Declaration on Forest as a tracking mechanism for the different goals of the declaration. Goal number 2 of the New York Declaration relates to the private sector commitments for deforestation-free supply chains by 2020. So there has been efforts by multiple organizations to join forces and assess progress of these goals, and there is going to be a report released during the COP that is going to share what information we have about the progress in meeting these goals. So that's one way. But I think the most important part, and linking it to the Climate Action Agenda, having the information and the data available, it's a great step, and it's a very strong effort, because then civil society organizations, academia, and other people can actually do their own analysis. And I think this is part of all being active and co-responsible. But there's, under the convention, I don't expect that we will see a mechanism to hold private sector accountable for. Now, if there's a mechanism in which countries can do that, I don't think there is. I think it depends on national legislation and how each country is approving the different investments that happen in a national territory. But again, if we have transparency and we push for this information to be open to the public, I think then it's easier for countries also to understand not only if companies are doing their share, but also if they are doing their share, why not try to make sense of how the private sector and the public sector can work together in having more ambitious NDCs. I hope this helps.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, and I think both of you can answer this from your different perspectives. So Naikoa, if you would start. This person is asking whether you would suggest countries to include REDD in their NDCs, and if so, which considerations should they take into account in that process? So maybe just briefly, what do you think the big considerations for countries if they want to include REDD in their NDCs are?
That's go ahead, Josefina, if you want to.
Okay, I can tell you there's been some discussions about this issue, and there's a paper that we can make available for you that discuss some of these issues of the relationship of REDD Plus with all these articles that we discussed today. But I think, as I mentioned, it will depend on each country and their approach to REDD Plus. However, I think one good approach to use to include REDD in NDCs could be to differentiate. Some countries have submitted conditional portions and unconditional portions to their NDC. So maybe in this conditional portion, the REDD effort can be more evident and say, well, this is what we do domestically without any help, but then if we get the incentives from REDD+, then we could do more. And what is it, how to articulate this additional effort? Because since REDD is an international framework that works in collaboration with like developing countries supporting these emissions reductions in developing countries, that could be better reflected perhaps in this conditional portion of NDCs, and that could help to clarify and to provide transparency to the process. But there's many countries that haven't clarified what portion of their NDCs is conditional or unconditional to support, so that is a challenge. I think it's important to capture REDD+ in their efforts, because what we've seen is normally, yeah, there's support from donors and support from multilaterals, but the forest country is doing a lot to make REDD work as well. There's a lot of domestic investment, so it should be a shame not to capture this in the national contributions. That would be my take on that. Naikoa, you want to add anything?
No, I agree. I think that it all depends on how the country wants to frame the use of the REDD activities and the results that may result from the implementation of mitigation actions. It's clear that REDD is an incentives mechanism, so some might say that countries should not include the REDD potential emissions reductions as part of their intended contributions. Or, as Josefina says, you can. Others might think that it should all go. But I think that there needs to be transparency on what specifically the country wants to have recognized and is proposing, and the rationale behind that. No, we have the example of countries that have committed or say that they would commit to reduce emissions from deforestation by a certain percentage without the need of support, and then have offered an additional amount of emissions reductions with a specific amount of support. So, I mean, I think it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, and I'm saying that based on the assessment of reference levels and the discussions with the constructors as well as the technical assessment team members. At the end of the day, the reference level and its use has to be looked at within the context and as a whole thing within which it was put together and it's proposed to be used. I hope this helps.
Thanks, Naikoa. Do either of you have any final thoughts before we end our Q&A and our webinar today?
Yes, Emmeline, thank you. I do want to say that when we are going to be looking at an intensification of the discussions on market mechanisms and whether REDD should be part or not, I think it's going to be tricky, because we definitely don't want forests to be used as an excuse for inaction. We want to have, we want to see real efforts and real emissions reductions and real transformation in all sectors. So it's going to be key that although we don't want to undermine the fact that we do need the support for continuing action in the forest sector and continuing emissions reductions from the forest sector, which are very important in some regions of the world, are the main source of emissions for some countries. We do want to keep the finance flowing and the support for this to happen, but not as an excuse for inaction in other sectors. So it's important for me to say that, and it's important also to recognize that in the current architecture, REDD projects in isolation, small-scale REDD projects that are not connected to the national strategies or action plans and the national accounting frameworks are becoming irrelevant. You cannot have a standalone small project that is not connecting to the national effort. So that's important also, because if there's any aim to buy offsets for small-scale projects that are invisible to national accounting, and that's not helping environmental integrity. So I just wanted to end with that, because I know that is going to be a controversial issue that we're going to be looking at in the next discussions in the next months. Thank you.
Thank you. Naikoa, did you have any last things you wanted to say?
Not much, just to emphasize that hopefully the momentum that we have seen with countries submitted their reference levels continues. I think this is clearly the type of materials and activities that will help us move the process forward, both in learning and showing what's been really used and not used to put reference levels and the MRV systems together. And it's the only way we can really discuss on how the implementation can move forward. I mean, basically, we've been talking about how to put these things together for, I don't know, over 6 years or 7. Now we're getting these things out there. Well, it's time to get moving.
Great, thank you. And we've actually gone a little bit over our time today, so I'm going to end the webinar now. But I want to thank both Josefina and Naikoa for sharing your expertise with us today. It's obviously you are both very deep wealths of knowledge, so it's always exciting for me to listen to you because I learn something new every time. And I really want to thank the participants for joining us and sending in your really thoughtful and engaging questions. I know there were a few that we didn't get to, so I'll try to organize some written answers that will go with the YouTube video recording when that goes up in the next day or so. You'll all also receive an email follow-up in the next few hours with more additional resources that are specific to this webinar. Next slide, please. If you want to revisit this webinar or share it with any colleagues, the recording will be up again in about a day or so, and you can also find recordings of previous sessions there on our YouTube channel for additional enrichment. Next slide, please. So thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.